June 4, 1942. 620 hours, Northwest Pacific Ocean, 240 miles from Midway Atoll. Flight Petty Officer First Class Kaname Harada gripped his pencil with trembling fingers as he scribbled in his flight log aboard the aircraft carrier Soryu. The Americans cannot possibly have organized such a response so quickly. We own the Pacific. We are invincible. His Zero fighter had just returned from the morning strike against Midway Island, and what he witnessed defied everything the Imperial Japanese Navy had proclaimed about American naval weakness and tactical incompetence. Through the salt-stained windows of Soryu's ready room, Harada watched American aircraft diving from the clouds like hawks descending upon prey. In the space of 5 minutes, everything would change. The Kido Butai, Japan's elite First Air Fleet, commanded by Vice Admiral Nagumo, was about to experience the most devastating defeat in naval aviation history. 4 aircraft carriers that had terrorized the Pacific for 6 months, that had reduced Pearl Harbor to burning wreckage and driven Allied forces from Southeast Asia to Australia, were about to be sunk by exactly 77 American aircraft. The mathematics of this catastrophe would haunt Japanese naval planners for the remainder of the war. How could an enemy they had dismissed as soft and technologically inferior coordinate such a precise strike? How could American pilots, flying supposedly inferior aircraft, penetrate the most sophisticated air defense system ever deployed at sea? The answers lay not just in American courage and determination, but in a series of tactical and strategic miscalculations that would transform the Pacific War in a single morning. The morning had begun with overwhelming confidence aboard the Japanese carriers. Admiral Yamamoto's plan for Operation MI, the capture of Midway Atoll, represented the culmination of 6 months of unbroken victory across the Pacific. Since Pearl Harbor, Japanese forces had conquered territory from the Aleutians to the Solomon Islands, sinking Allied warships, capturing strategic bases, and establishing what they believed was an impregnable defensive perimeter. The Kido Butai, consisting of the fleet carriers Akagi, Kaga, Soryu, and Hiryu, represented the most powerful naval striking force ever assembled. Captain Mitsuo Fuchida, who had led the Pearl Harbor attack and now served as Akagi's air group commander, later described the confidence that permeated the Japanese fleet that morning. We had not lost a single major warship to enemy action. American aircraft had proven incapable of effectively striking our carriers. Their pilots lacked the skill and dedication of our airmen. We expected Midway to fall within hours, and the American Pacific Fleet to sail into our trap where we would destroy them completely. The Japanese force approaching Midway was indeed formidable. Admiral Yamamoto had assembled over 200 ships for Operation MI, including 11 battleships, 8 aircraft carriers, 22 cruisers, and 65 destroyers. The Kido Butai alone carried 248 of Japan's most experienced pilots, flying Zero fighters, Val dive bombers, and Kate torpedo bombers. These were the same air crews that had devastated Pearl Harbor, sunk HMS Prince of Wales and Repulse, and dominated the skies over the Dutch East Indies and Philippines. At 0430 hours on June 4th, the first wave of 108 Japanese aircraft launched from the 4 carriers to strike Midway. Lieutenant Joichi Tomonaga led 36 Kate torpedo bombers and Val dive bombers, escorted by 36 Zero fighters, in what was intended to be the opening blow of Japan's final push toward Hawaii. The attack was methodically planned and expertly executed, representing everything Japanese naval aviation had learned from 6 months of combat. But unknown to the Japanese, American codebreakers had penetrated their naval communications. Station Hypo at Pearl Harbor, led by Commander Joseph Rochefort, had been reading Japanese naval codes since early 1942. They knew that AF meant Midway, they knew the date of the attack, and most crucially, they knew the composition and approach routes of Yamamoto's fleet. Admiral Chester Nimitz, commanding the Pacific Fleet, had positioned 3 American aircraft carriers, Enterprise, Hornet, and Yorktown, northeast of Midway in perfect ambush position. The American force was significantly smaller than the Japanese fleet. Task Force 16, commanded by Rear Admiral Raymond Spruance, included Enterprise and Hornet with their escorts. Task Force 17, under Rear Admiral Frank Jack Fletcher, consisted of Yorktown, hastily repaired after damage at the Coral Sea, and her screening vessels. The Americans deployed 233 carrier-based aircraft against the Japanese force, along with 127 land-based aircraft on Midway itself. As the Japanese strike approached Midway, Marine fighters rose to intercept them. Captain Marion Carl, flying an F-4F Wildcat, led 25 Marine fighters against the incoming formation. The ensuing air battle demonstrated both American courage and the technological superiority of Japanese aircraft. The Zero fighters accompanying the strike shot down 15 Marine aircraft, while losing only 3 of their own. However, the fierce resistance convinced Lieutenant Tomonaga that a second strike would be necessary to neutralize Midway's defenses. At 0700 hours, Tomonaga radioed his famous message to Admiral Nagumo. There is need for a second attack wave. This transmission would trigger a series of decisions that ultimately doomed the Kido Butai. Nagumo faced a dilemma that would have challenged any naval commander. He had held back 107 aircraft in reserve, armed with torpedoes and armor-piercing bombs for use against American ships. Tomonaga's message suggested he should rearm these aircraft with land attack ordnance for a second strike against Midway. The rearming process began at 7:15 hours. In the hangars of all 4 carriers, ground crews worked feverishly to replace torpedoes with bombs, to switch armor-piercing ordnance for high-explosive rounds. This process, which normally required 90 minutes, was complicated by the need to maintain combat air patrol over the fleet and prepare for the recovery of the Midway strike force. The Japanese carriers became floating arsenals, their hangars packed with armed aircraft, fuel lines, and explosive ordnance. At 728 hours, the delayed scout plane from the cruiser Tone made a sighting report that changed everything. Sighted 10 enemy surface ships, bearing 10 degrees, distance 240 miles from Midway. The report was vague and contained no information about the composition of the American force. Nagumo immediately reversed his rearming order, demanding that the scout clarify the nature of the enemy ships. 28 crucial minutes passed before Tone's aircraft radioed. Enemy force accompanied by what appears to be aircraft carrier. The presence of American carriers transformed the tactical situation. Admiral Nagumo now faced multiple threats. The Midway strike force was returning and needed to land before running out of fuel. American carrier aircraft might attack at any moment. His own strike aircraft were in various stages of rearming, some configured for land attack, others for anti-ship operations. The orderly Japanese battle plan was dissolving into chaos. Rear Admiral Taman Yamaguchi, commanding Carrier Division 2 from Hiryu, urged immediate action. He recommended launching the partially armed aircraft against the American carriers while the Midway strike was still returning. Yamaguchi understood that dispersed attacks might be less effective than coordinated strikes, but he also recognized that delay would allow the Americans to strike first. His recommendation represented sound tactical thinking, but Nagumo chose to wait for a fully coordinated attack. This decision reflected Japanese naval doctrine, which emphasized maximum concentration of force and perfect coordination. The Japanese had trained extensively in massed carrier strikes, and their success at Pearl Harbor had validated this approach. However, doctrine designed for surprise attacks against stationary targets proved inflexible when facing an alert enemy capable of immediate response. At 8:20 hours, the first wave of American carrier aircraft was already airborne and heading toward the Japanese fleet. Admiral Spruance had launched his strike from maximum range, accepting the risk of fuel shortages in order to attack while the Japanese were vulnerable. Enterprise launched 33 dive bombers, 14 torpedo bombers, and 10 fighters. Hornet contributed 35 dive bombers, 15 torpedo bombers, and 10 fighters. The American aircraft faced a 175-mile flight to reach their targets. The American strike aircraft faced numerous challenges. Navigation over the open ocean required precise calculations and constant vigilance. Fuel consumption had to be carefully monitored to ensure sufficient reserves for the return flight. Most critically, the different types of aircraft flew at different speeds and altitudes, making coordinated attacks extremely difficult without extensive practice and communication. The first American aircraft to locate the Japanese fleet were the torpedo bombers from Hornet. Torpedo Squadron 8, commanded by Lieutenant Commander John Waldron, had broken away from the main Hornet strike group and flew directly toward the enemy. At 0920 hours, VT-8 sighted the Japanese carriers and began their attack approach. What followed was a massacre that would become legend in naval aviation. Waldron's 15 TBD Devastator torpedo bombers attacked without fighter escort against 4 aircraft carriers, defended by 50 Zero fighters and intense anti-aircraft fire. The obsolete Devastators, capable of only 206 miles per hour when carrying torpedoes, were sitting ducks for the faster, more maneuverable Zeros. Within minutes, all 15 aircraft were shot down. Only Ensign George Gay survived, floating in the Pacific throughout the battle while watching events unfold around him. At 0940 hours, Torpedo Squadron 6 from Enterprise met the same fate. Lieutenant Commander Eugene Lindsay led 14 Devastators against the Japanese fleet. Japanese Zeros attacked the formation 8 miles from their targets, shooting down 10 aircraft before they could release their torpedoes. The survivors pressed home their attacks but achieved no hits before being destroyed or forced to withdraw. The slaughter continued when Yorktown's Torpedo Squadron 3 attacked at 1000 hours. Lieutenant Commander Lance Massey led 12 Devastators in the most coordinated attack of the morning, supported by 6 Wildcat fighters. Even with fighter escort, VT-3 suffered devastating losses. 10 torpedo bombers were shot down, and the escorting fighters were overwhelmed by the sheer number of defending Zeros. American torpedo squadrons suffered catastrophic losses in their uncoordinated attacks. VT-8 from Hornet lost all 15 aircraft, VT-6 from Enterprise lost 10 of 14, and VT-3 from Yorktown lost 10 of 12 aircraft. Of 41 torpedo bombers launched, only 6 returned to their carriers. However, their sacrifice proved decisive by drawing Japanese fighters down to sea level, just as American dive bombers approached from high altitude. Unknown to the Japanese, the sacrifice of the torpedo squadrons had created the perfect conditions for the next phase of the American attack. While Zeros were engaged at low altitude, American dive bombers were approaching from high altitude, hidden by cloud cover. The timing was not planned, but purely coincidental. Enterprise's dive bombers, led by Lieutenant Commander Wade McCluskey, had initially flown toward the wrong coordinates and only located the Japanese fleet by following the wake of the destroyer Arashi. At 10:20 hours, McCluskey's 33 SBD Dauntless dive bombers achieved perfect tactical position above the Japanese fleet. The carriers were steaming into the wind, preparing to launch aircraft. Their flight decks were crowded with fueled and armed aircraft, and damage control crews were scattered across the ships handling routine maintenance. Most critically, the Japanese Combat Air Patrol was still at low altitude and out of position to intercept high-altitude dive bombers. The attack that followed lasted exactly 6 minutes and changed the course of the Pacific War. McCluskey divided his force, sending Bombing Squadron 6 against Akagi and Scouting Squadron 6 against Kaga. Simultaneously, Yorktown's Bombing Squadron 3, led by Lieutenant Commander Max Leslie, attacked Soryu from a different approach angle. The American dive bombers achieved complete surprise, diving from 15,000 feet with the sun behind them. Lieutenant Richard Best, leading VB-6, placed his 1,000-pound bomb directly amidships on Akagi, penetrating the flight deck and exploding among the armed aircraft below. The blast ignited aviation fuel and ordnance, creating a chain reaction that spread throughout the ship. Captain Taijiro Aoki, Akagi's commanding officer, later described the explosion as transforming his ship into a blazing inferno within seconds. Kaga suffered even more devastating damage. 4 dive bombers from VS-6 scored direct hits on the carrier's flight deck, hangar and island structure. The largest Japanese carrier, displacing 38,200 tons, was transformed into a floating funeral pyre. Captain Jisaku Okada and most of his bridge crew were killed instantly when a bomb exploded near the ship's command center. Commander Takahisa Amagai, the air officer, assumed command of the dying vessel. Soryu, the newest and fastest of the Japanese carriers, received 3 direct hits from VB-3. The first bomb struck forward of the bridge, the second hit amidships, and the third detonated near the stern. All 3 explosions occurred among fueled and armed aircraft, creating secondary detonations that ripped through the ship's structure. Within minutes, Soryu was enveloped in flames from bow to stern. Captain Mitsuo Fuchida, aboard Akagi during the attack, described the scene with characteristic Japanese precision. The terrifying scream of the dive bombers reached me first, followed by the crashing explosion of a direct hit. There was a blinding flash and then a second explosion, much louder than the first. I was shaken by a weird blast of warm air. Looking about, I was horrified at the destruction that had been wrought in a matter of seconds. The attack had achieved tactical surprise because Japanese doctrine did not anticipate uncoordinated attacks. The sacrifice of the torpedo squadrons had drawn defending fighters out of position, while poor visibility had concealed the approaching dive bombers. American pilots had attacked from multiple directions simultaneously, dividing Japanese defensive fire and making evasive maneuvering impossible. The devastation aboard the 3 carriers was beyond anything experienced in modern naval warfare. Akagi's hangar deck became a furnace of burning aviation fuel and exploding ordnance. Kaga's flight deck buckled under the heat of internal fires, and her island structure collapsed into twisted metal. Soryu listed heavily to port as flooding competed with fire damage to destroy the ship's structural integrity. Rescue efforts aboard all 3 carriers demonstrated Japanese naval tradition and discipline under extreme circumstances. Damage control parties fought fires with every available resource, often at the cost of their lives. Medical personnel treated wounded shipmates while the deck plates beneath their feet grew too hot to touch. Engine room crews maintained power and steering until ordered to abandon their stations. The psychological impact on Japanese personnel was as devastating as the physical damage to their ships. Petty Officer First Class Juzo Mori, serving aboard Kaga, later wrote, "We had believed ourselves invincible. Our carriers had dominated every sea from Hawaii to Australia. In 6 minutes, 3 of our proudest ships were burning wrecks. How could this have happened? How could the Americans achieve such precision?" Admiral Nagumo faced an unprecedented crisis. 3/4 of his striking force had been eliminated in a single attack. The remaining carrier, Hiryu, was too distant from the burning ships to provide immediate assistance. Japanese doctrine had never contemplated such a scenario, and no contingency plans existed for this level of catastrophic loss. At 10:50 hours, Rear Admiral Yamaguchi aboard Hiryu launched a hastily organized counterstrike against the American carriers. 18 VAL dive bombers and 6 Zero fighters, led by Lieutenant Michio Kobayashi, attacked Yorktown at 1200 hours. The American carrier, commanded by Captain Elliot Buckmaster, had maintained combat air patrol and was prepared for the assault. The Japanese attack achieved partial success, scoring 3 direct hits on Yorktown. The bombs damaged the flight deck, knocked out several boilers, and started fires throughout the ship. However, American damage control procedures, perfected through months of combat experience, contained the damage. Within 2 hours, Yorktown was steaming at 19 knots and recovering aircraft. At 13:31 hours, Hiryu launched a second strike. 10 Kate torpedo bombers and 6 Zeros, led by Lieutenant Joichi Tomonaga, attacked Yorktown from multiple directions. 2 torpedoes struck the carrier's port side, flooding several compartments and knocking out electrical power. Captain Buckmaster ordered the ship abandoned, but Yorktown remained afloat, testament to American shipbuilding and damage control expertise. The success of Hiryu's attacks demonstrated Japanese naval aviation skill, but they also revealed the limits of hastily organized strikes. The attacks were smaller and less coordinated than typical Japanese operations. American combat air patrol had intercepted many of the attacking aircraft, and ship-based anti-aircraft fire had damaged others. Most significantly, the strikes had not eliminated American carrier striking power. The afternoon of June 4th witnessed the final act of the Kido Butai's destruction. Hiryu, the sole surviving Japanese carrier, launched desperate counterattacks against the American fleet. Rear Admiral Tamon Yamaguchi, commanding from Hiryu's bridge, demonstrated the aggressive spirit that had characterized Japanese naval aviation since Pearl Harbor. His hastily organized strikes achieved remarkable success against overwhelming odds, severely damaging Yorktown and proving that Japanese fighting spirit remained unbroken despite catastrophic losses. At 1200 hours, 18 Val dive bombers and 6 Zero fighters from Hiryu struck Yorktown with precision that honored Japanese naval tradition. 3 direct bomb hits penetrated the American carrier's flight deck, knocked out several boilers, and started fires throughout the ship. Lieutenant Michio Kobayashi, leading the attack, pressed home his assault despite heavy anti-aircraft fire and determined fighter opposition. The success of this strike demonstrated that individual Japanese units retained their deadly effectiveness even after the morning's disasters. Yamaguchi's second strike at 1331 hours achieved even greater tactical success. 10 Kate torpedo bombers and 6 Zeros, led by the wounded Lieutenant Joichi Tomonaga, attacked Yorktown from multiple directions in a textbook example of coordinated assault. 2 torpedoes struck the carrier's port side, causing severe flooding and electrical failures. Captain Elliot Buckmaster ordered the ship abandoned, though American damage control efforts would later bring Yorktown back to limited service. However, these tactical successes could not compensate for Japan's strategic disaster. Hiryu's strikes, while expertly executed, were smaller and less coordinated than typical Japanese operations. The hasty organization showed in reduced aircraft numbers and limited fighter escort. Most critically, the attacks had not eliminated American carrier striking power, as Enterprise and Hornet remained fully operational and prepared for immediate counterattack. American response demonstrated the strategic flexibility that would characterize Pacific operations for the remainder of the war. Rather than being paralyzed by Yorktown's damage, Admiral Spruance immediately organized retaliatory strikes against Hiryu. The speed and efficiency of American reaction revealed organizational competence that matched Japanese tactical skill. At 1500 hours, Enterprise launched 24 SBD Dauntless dive bombers, augmented by surviving aircraft from Yorktown's air group. The final attack on Hiryu at 1700 hours completed the destruction of Japanese carrier power at Midway. Lieutenant Wilmer Gallagher led the American dive bombers in a coordinated assault that demonstrated lessons learned from the morning's success. The attackers approached from multiple directions, saturating Japanese defenses and ensuring maximum bomb hits. 4 direct hits struck Hiryu's flight deck and hangar areas, starting fires among fueled aircraft that would prove impossible to contain. Admiral Yamaguchi's decision to remain aboard his flagship exemplified the warrior code that had driven Japanese expansion across the Pacific. Rather than transfer his flag to another vessel, he chose to share the fate of his ship and crew. His final radio message to Admiral Nagumo captured the transformation that Midway had wrought in Japanese naval thinking. "We have lost 4 carriers, but the spirit of the Imperial Navy remains unbroken. We shall fight to the end." The human cost of Midway extended far beyond the immediate battle casualties. Families throughout Japan would soon receive notification that their sons, husbands, and fathers had perished in a naval engagement whose true scope remained hidden from public knowledge. The government's decision to suppress accurate reporting of the disaster meant that Japanese civilians continued to believe in naval supremacy, even as that supremacy lay beneath Pacific waters. For Japanese naval aviation, Midway represented the end of an era that had begun with Pearl Harbor. The elite air crews who had perfected carrier operations through years of intensive training were either dead or captured. Their replacement would require training programs that Japan's wartime economy could barely support. More critically, the institutional knowledge that died with these men, the accumulated expertise of successful carrier operations, could never be fully recovered. The attack on Hiryu demonstrated American learning from the morning's success. The dive bombers attacked from multiple directions, saturating Japanese defenses. 4 bombs hit the carrier's flight deck and hangar, starting fires among fueled aircraft. Unlike the earlier attacks, American pilots specifically targeted Hiryu's island structure and aviation fuel systems, maximizing damage potential. Hiryu's fate was sealed by the same factors that had doomed her sister ships. Armed and fueled aircraft created secondary explosions that spread fires throughout the vessel. Damage control efforts were hampered by the loss of electrical power and water pressure. Within hours, Japan's last operational carrier in the Midway operation was a burning wreck. The loss of 4 fleet carriers in a single day represented the greatest naval disaster in Japanese history. These were not obsolete vessels, but the most modern and capable ships in the Japanese fleet. Akagi and Kaga had been extensively modernized in the 1930s. Soryu and Hiryu were new construction, incorporating lessons learned from earlier carrier designs. Their loss eliminated Japan's offensive capability in the Pacific. The human cost was equally devastating. Over 3,000 Japanese sailors died at Midway, including many of the Navy's most experienced pilots and maintenance personnel. These were irreplaceable assets, trained over years of intensive instruction. Flight Petty Officer Harada, who survived Soryu's sinking, later reflected, "We lost not just ships, but the knowledge and experience that had made us masters of the Pacific." The aircraft losses compounded the disaster. All 248 carrier-based aircraft were lost, along with numerous float planes from cruisers and battleships. Japan's aircraft industry, already stretched by global commitments, could not rapidly replace such losses. More critically, the experienced aircrew who perished represented years of training investment that could never be recovered. American losses, while significant, were far more manageable. Yorktown was eventually sunk by Japanese submarine the Fon 168 on June 7th, and the destroyer Hammond was lost during the same attack. Aircraft losses totaled 150 machines, but most American aircrew survived to fight again. The industrial capacity to replace American losses already existed and was rapidly expanding. The tactical lessons of Midway resonated throughout both navies. Japanese naval doctrine, based on maximum concentration and perfect coordination, had proven vulnerable to flexible, aggressive opponents. The decision to maintain formation and wait for perfect attacking conditions had allowed the Americans to strike first with devastating results. Japanese air defense, designed to repel conventional attacks, could not handle multiple simultaneous assaults from different directions. American tactics, while initially appearing suicidal, had achieved decisive results through persistence and adaptation. The sacrifice of torpedo squadrons had created conditions for dive bomber success. The ability to launch attacks from maximum range had achieved tactical surprise. Most importantly, American willingness to accept losses in pursuit of strategic objectives had overcome Japanese technical advantages. The strategic implications of the Midway defeat transformed Japanese naval planning for the remainder of the war. Admiral Yamamoto's plan to force a decisive engagement with the American fleet had backfired catastrophically. Instead of destroying American naval power, the Japanese had lost their own capacity for offensive operations. The initiative in the Pacific passed permanently to the United States. Japanese industrial capacity, already strained by global commitments, could not rapidly replace the lost carriers. The Shokaku and Zuikaku, damaged at Coral Sea, would not return to service for months. New carrier construction would not provide replacement vessels until 1944. For over 2 years, Japan would lack the carrier strength necessary for major offensive operations. The psychological impact on Japanese leadership was equally profound. The myth of Japanese invincibility, carefully cultivated since Pearl Harbor, lay shattered on the floor of the Pacific. Senior officers who had confidently planned the conquest of Hawaii and Australia now faced the prospect of defensive warfare against an increasingly powerful enemy. Emperor Hirohito, informed of the disaster by Admiral Nagumo, reportedly asked, "How could this have happened?" Our Navy assured me that American fighting spirit was inferior to Japanese dedication. The Emperor's question reflected widespread Japanese confusion about how their supposedly superior forces had been defeated by an enemy they had consistently underestimated. The cover-up of the Midway defeat demonstrated Japanese government fears about public morale. Official announcements described the battle as a minor tactical engagement with limited losses. Surviving personnel were quarantined to prevent them from discussing the disaster. The truth about Midway would not be revealed to the Japanese public until after the war. For the United States, Midway validated the strategic decisions made by Admiral Nimitz and his staff. The decision to commit all available carriers to the battle had been controversial, but the results justified the risk. American intelligence, industrial capacity, and fighting spirit had combined to achieve one of the most decisive victories in naval history. The Battle of Midway marked the turning point of the Pacific War, but its lessons extended beyond military strategy. American success had resulted from superior intelligence gathering, flexible tactics, and the courage of individual servicemen. Japanese failure stemmed from rigid doctrine, intelligence failures, and overconfidence born of early success. Flight Petty Officer Harada, who survived the sinking of Soryu and was later captured, spent 3 years in American prisoner of war camps. In his post-war memoirs he wrote, "We thought Americans were soft and cowardly. We learned they were neither. We thought their equipment was inferior to ours. We discovered we were wrong. We thought their tactics were primitive. They proved more sophisticated than our own." The 77 American aircraft that sank 4 Japanese carriers on June 4, 1942, represented more than tactical success. They embodied the industrial power, technological innovation, and democratic determination that would ultimately triumph in the Pacific War. The pilots who pressed home their attacks against overwhelming odds demonstrated that American fighting spirit was equal to any enemy. The legacy of Midway extended far beyond the Pacific theater. The battle proved that air power, properly applied, could achieve decisive results against surface forces. It demonstrated the importance of intelligence in modern warfare. Most significantly, it showed that technological superiority and tactical excellence could overcome numerical disadvantage when combined with strategic insight and personal courage. In the decades following the war, American and Japanese veterans of Midway would meet in friendship and mutual respect. They shared memories of that fateful day when 77 American aircraft changed the course of history. Flight Petty Officer Harada, attending a reunion in Honolulu in 1987, reflected, "We were enemies then, but we fought with honor on both sides. The Americans won through skill and courage. We lost through overconfidence and tactical error. Both sides learned lessons that served us well in peace." The Battle of Midway remains a testament to the unpredictable nature of warfare and the decisive impact that small numbers of determined individuals can achieve under the right circumstances. 77 American aircraft, flown by men who refused to quit despite overwhelming opposition, transformed a Japanese victory into catastrophic defeat. Their achievement reminds us that in war, as in life, courage and determination can overcome seemingly impossible odds. The mathematics of that June morning were simple yet profound. 77 American aircraft attacked 4 Japanese carriers defended by hundreds of fighters and anti-aircraft guns. By any conventional calculation, the attack should have failed. Instead, it succeeded beyond all expectations, sinking all 4 enemy vessels and changing the balance of power in the Pacific. The secret lay not in numbers or technology, but in the hearts and minds of the men who flew those planes into battle. As the sun set on June 4, 1942, the Pacific War had been fundamentally transformed. Japanese naval power, which had dominated the ocean for 6 months, lay broken beneath the waves. American carriers, which had survived through skill and fortune, prepared for the long campaign that would carry them to Tokyo Bay. The age of Japanese expansion was over. The era of American advance had begun. And it all happened because 77 American aircraft proved that courage, properly applied, could achieve the impossible.